The ant spirit returns a village's endless fear. Summary. At 3 a.m., a peaceful village shrouded in thick darkness was disrupted by the frantic cries of a woman named Mary. She arrived at the wealthiest house in the village, trembling and gasping for air, delivering chilling news to her sister-in-law, Anna. What followed was a nightmarish chain of events, eerie whispers, haunted echoes, and a creeping sense of dread that spiraled into terror. A tragic death, family conflicts, and unresolved grievances turned the house into a vessel for horror. Amid shadows and inexplicable happenings, the ghostly presence of a dead woman unleashed vengeance upon those who betrayed her. Anna, caught between disbelief and mounting fear, faced unspeakable terrors in the dead of night hallucinations, footsteps in empty corridors, and a spectral figure that stared back from the abyss. Reality and nightmare blurred as Anna unraveled the bitter truth behind the haunting, leaving her scarred forever. This is the story of betrayal, despair, and an unforgiving ghost who returned to make her presence known. Part 1. The Midnight Disruption. The village lay submerged in a choking darkness, so thick it swallowed everything it touched. There was no moon that night, only a vast, empty black sky and the low hum of silence that clung like mist to the forgotten streets. Even the animals had retreated into themselves, their nocturnal cries silenced as if in fearful reverence. At 3 a.m., the world was hollow, a void where light dared not linger, and the veil between life and death frayed into near transparency. Then it began. A sound, faint at first, like the last gasping breaths of something suffocating. It crept through the village on trembling tendrils of air, the sputtering coffin engine distant, hesitant, and growing louder. It clawed at the night, vibrating off the walls of cottages that lined the dirt road, shaking dust from their eaves and shutters. Mary rode through the darkness like a woman possessed. Her motorcycle screamed against the uneven road, its wheels kicking up sprays of loose gravel and dirt as it lurched violently forward. Her face was streaked with sweat and grime, her hair whipped about her face, tangled and wild. The weak beam of her headlight swept the path ahead in frantic arcs, carving gaping holes into the abyss holes that the shadows eagerly swallowed. Her hands clutched the handlebars so tightly her knuckles turned white, the trembling of her arms rattling the motorcycle beneath her like brittle bones. She glanced to the sides, her breath quick and ragged, searching for what? She didn't know. All she knew was that she wasn't alone. Something was out there. It moved with her, just beyond the edge of the light, unseen but undeniable. The further she rode, the heavier it became, like the night itself was chasing her, pressing against her back, whispering terrible things she couldn't hear. Then came the sound. Creak, creak, creak. It was faint, barely there, hidden beneath the roar of the engine. But she heard it. Mary's eyes darted over her shoulder. There was nothing but blackness so complete it looked solid. Yet the sound followed her, matching her speed, keeping pace. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The bike jolted violently, and she nearly lost control. No, 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 she whispered, the words frantic prayers. Her trembling hands twisted the throttle, and the motorcycle screamed louder, faster. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The figure that loomed in her periphery, faceless, formless, was waiting for that, for her to fall, for her to surrender. Her salvation appeared like a mirage at the end of the road. Anna's house. It loomed large, its iron gates tall and solemn against the trees. Pale light spilled weakly from a window on the second floor, a beacon barely strong enough to pierce the suffocating dark. Mary skidded to a halt, the tires shrieking as they bit into the dirt. She staggered off the bike, her legs weak and unsteady beneath her. Her feet hit the ground, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. Blood and mud smeared across her palms, but she didn't care. She clawed her way toward the gate, her fingernails scraping against the cold iron as she reached it. Anna, she screamed. Her voice tore through the silence like a jagged knife. Anna, open the door. Her fists slammed into the gate again and again, the metal vibrating under her desperate blows. The sound echoed like gunfire in the stillness, loud and unnatural. Dogs began to bark shrill, terrified sounds in homes far away, as if they too could feel what lingered in the night. "Anna, please," Mary sobbed, her voice cracking. Her throat burned, but she couldn't stop. Her hands fell to the gate, trembling so violently that she couldn't hold onto it anymore. She pressed her forehead against the cold iron, her tears pooling beneath her as she whispered, "Please. Please open the door inside the house." Anna woke with a start. The banging jolted her upright, her heart pounding against her ribs. It took a moment for her to make sense of the sound, the violent clatter of metal, mixed with screams that rose and fell like waves. Her room was pitch black, save for the faint, silvery sliver of light that fell through the curtains. The clock on her bedside table read 3:10 a.m. Who would come here at this hour? Anna swung her legs over the bed, her bare feet recoiling against the cold tiles. She reached for her robe, hands fumbling to tie it shut as she moved quickly down the hallway. The old wooden stairs creaked under her weight, groaning as though warning her not to continue. The noise grew louder as she descended, banging, shouting, and the sharp, metallic sound of something rattling. Her pulse quickened. Each step forward brought her closer to the door, where she could now hear her name being screamed. "Anna, please. Open up." The voice was familiar, but distorted, warped by panic, and something else Anna couldn't quite place. She reached for the door, hesitating only when her fingers touched the cold brass handle. "Mary," she whispered, her breath visible in the icy air. Her hand twisted the lock with a loud click, and the door opened slowly. Mary fell into her arms. Her body was like ice, her hair damp and clinging to her face in thin strands. Her eyes, wide and red-rimmed, met Anna's with a look of terror so raw it seemed inhuman. "Mary," Anna stammered, her voice soft with confusion and dread. "What happened to you?" Mary sagged into Anna, her body trembling violently. "She's gone," Mary choked out. "She's dead, Anna. Emily's dead." The words were like a stone sinking into the pit of Anna's stomach. "Emily," Anna repeated, her voice hollow. What do you mean?" Mary's hands clutched Anna's arms with desperate strength. "She's gone," she repeated, her voice little more than a whisper now. "But she's not. She's not gone. She's back." Anna froze. "What are you talking about?" Mary raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the road beyond the gate. Anna followed her gaze, her chest tight, her breath shallow. At first, there was nothing, just shadows and darkness. But then, it moved. A figure. A tall, thin silhouette, standing perfectly still. Its shape was unclear, as though it belonged to the shadows themselves, but it was there, watching. Anna stumbled backward, pulling Mary with her as she slammed the door shut. Her hand shook as she locked it, but the cold still seeped through the wood. "What's happening?" she whispered, almost to herself. Mary collapsed onto the floor, her body racked with sobs. "It's Emily," she said, her voice barely audible. "She's come back. And she won't leave." Anna stood frozen, her mind racing. Outside, the faintest sound crept in through the doorframe, a slow, rhythmic creak. 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 Like the sway of a rope. Part 2. The tragic death. The evening air was heavy, the kind of weight that wrapped around the chest like a vice. The sun had disappeared hours ago, leaving only a faint red smear on the horizon as darkness swallowed the village whole. Emily's house stood at the edge of town, a withering structure that had seen better days, its paint peeling like old skin and its roof sagging with age. Inside, the air was stale, laced with something darker and oppressive stillness that clung to the walls. Emily sat alone in the corner of her small, dimly lit room, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The only source of light was the faint flicker of an oil lamp on the crooked table beside her, its glow barely enough to chase the shadows from the room. Her reflection in the cracked window pane looked less like a person and more like a ghost of who she used to be, a hollow, sunken face, eyes rimmed with bruises, lips cracked and bloodied. The house was silent, save for the occasional sound of something dripping in the kitchen sink, a sound that, in the quiet, felt like a ticking clock counting down to some inevitable end. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow and uneven. In her mind, she could hear his voice again. Loud, slurred, filled with venom. Useless, he'd screamed earlier that day. "You're nothing. Emily. Nothing, he'd thrown her into the wall then. Her head still ached where it had hit the corner. Her husband's rage was a storm that never passed, and she was always its target. The bruises on her skin were fading, but there would always be fresh ones. Always new wounds to replace the old. She had once dreamed of escaping and running far away, where he could never find her. But there was nowhere to go. Her family had abandoned her, one by one. They turned their backs when she cried for help. Her neighbors looked the other way, whispering behind closed doors but never stepping in. And Mary. Sweet, naive Mary. Her sister, who still held on to hope that the man could change, that maybe love could fix everything. But love wasn't enough, Emily thought bitterly. Her fingers dug into her arms as she stared blankly at the floorboards. The sound of the dripping faucet grew louder. It echoed in her ears, deafening, until it wasn't just water she heard. It was a voice. Soft, persistent, familiar. They'll never rest, Emily. Not after what they did to you, she looked up sharply. The room was empty, but the voice lingered, swirling around her like cold air. It wasn't her imagination, it couldn't be. Someone was here, unseen, whispering secrets only she could hear. Who are you? She choked out. Her voice sounded small, broken. No answer came, but the voice echoed again, deeper this time, seeping into her bones like poison. They left you. Let you suffer. And they will suffer in return. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the voice only grew louder, feeding off her fear. Make them see. Make them remember. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and move, as though something were lurking just beyond her vision. Emily sobbed, her shoulders shaking, her entire body trembling as the voice coiled tighter and tighter around her like a snake. None of them will rest, Emily. None of them, she screamed, the sound ripping through her throat and echoing in the empty house. It was the scream of someone who had nothing left, no hope, no love, no escape. And then it stopped. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. When Mary arrived at Emily's house hours later, the first thing she noticed was how quiet it was. The door was ajar, swaying slightly on its rusted hinges. She hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding. Something felt wrong, so terribly, unspeakably wrong. Emily, she called softly, her voice cracking as it disappeared into the darkness. There was no answer. She stepped inside, her shoes creaking against the warped floorboards. The house was freezing, the air thick with something she couldn't name. Mary's hands shook as she fumbled for the light switch, but the bulb overhead merely flickered, throwing erratic shadows onto the walls before giving out entirely. Mary tried again, her voice louder this time, but still met only by silence. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dark, and that's when she saw it. At the far end of the room, hanging from the ceiling beam, was Emily. Mary froze, a strangled cry caught in her throat. Emily's lifeless body swayed gently, the rope creaking with the same rhythm as the dripping sink creak. Creak, creak. Her head hung limply to one side, her hair hiding most of her face. But her eyes were open, wide and staring, as if they were looking at something far beyond the room. Her lips were curled into a faint, unnatural smile that chilled Mary to her core. Scrawled across the wall behind her, in jagged letters that looked as though they had been scratched into the plaster with bare hands, was a message: none of you will rest. Mary stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her legs gave out, and she fell to the floor, unable to tear her eyes away from Emily's lifeless form. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. No, 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 her screams filled the house, but no one came. The news of Emily's death spread like wildfire through the village by morning. Whispers passed from house to house, spoken in hushed, fearful tones. They said Emily's spirit lingered in the house, that her death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a curse. No one dared go near the property, and even those who had turned their backs on her in life now locked their doors and windows at night, as though afraid of something unseen slipping inside. But it wasn't only Emily's house that changed. Mary couldn't escape the image of her sister, the hollow stare, the creaking rope, the words on the wall. Everywhere she went, she heard it creak. 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 And sometimes when she passed a mirror, she thought she saw her sister standing just behind her, watching. Part 4. The first signs of haunting. That night, Anna lay in bed, unable to sleep. The events of the day played in her mind like a broken record, refusing to release their grip. Mary's tear-streaked face haunted her, the trembling hands, and those words, "She's back, Anna." The phrase seemed absurd, impossible even, but the look in Mary's eyes made it hard to dismiss. There had been something real about her terror, something Anna couldn't shake. The room around her was silent. Too silent. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The air was cold, heavy. Anna shifted beneath the blanket, pulling it up to her chin as if it could protect her from the chill gnawing at her bones. Outside, the faintest tap, tap, tap against the window made her flinch. It was the tree branch. It had been brushing against the glass for years, yet tonight it sounded wrong. Like fingers methodically drumming. "It's just the wind," Anna told herself. The clock on the nightstand glowed 3:07 a.m. Anna exhaled slowly, forcing her body to relax, but the silence pressed closer, clinging to her ears like cotton. Then it came soft at first. A noise. Creak, 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 creak. Her heart stopped. The sound came from above her. She froze, straining her ears. It was faint, deliberate, like weight shifting back and forth. A memory surfaced: the rocking chair. Grandmother's old wooden rocker, stored in the attic for years. But that chair hadn't moved since it was packed away. The creaking continued. Rhythmic. Purposeful. Anna's gaze snapped to the ceiling, her breath shallow. "Is something up there?" "No," she told herself. "It's just the house settling. Old houses make noise." But even as the thought surfaced, she knew it wasn't true. The sound was too even, too intentional. Then it stopped. Anna swallowed hard, her ears straining in the silence that followed. Her body trembled as she turned toward the clock. 3:13 a.m. Witching hour. She'd heard the stories growing up, how this was the time when spirits crossed between worlds. Ridiculous, she thought. Then thump. 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 Anna shot upright in bed, clutching the blanket. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Heavy, slow, deliberate, moving across the attic. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She couldn't look away from the ceiling, as though the wood would splinter and something would come crashing through. The footsteps stopped directly above her bed. Silence fell, thicker than before. Then something scraped. Skrrarkare. Skrrarkare was long and slow, like fingernails dragging across the wooden floor. The sound sent a shiver racing down her spine. Anna couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She lay there, paralyzed, until the scraping stopped abruptly. The room felt colder. Anna could see her breath now, fogging in the air. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Then she heard it, sobbing. At first it was faint, a whisper of sound. But it grew louder, a woman's sobs, broken and trembling, drifting through the house. The voice sounded close, far too close. Mariana whispered, though she knew Mary wasn't there. The sobbing stopped. Anna's skin prickled as the silence returned. But then came the footsteps, this time, in the hallway outside her room. Each step was deliberate, moving toward her door. Thump, thump, thump. Anna turned her gaze to the door, the pulse deafening in her ears. The handle rattled softly. A faint, metallic click. "Who's there?" Anna croaked, her voice small and shaking. The handle stilled. Silence. But Anna felt it, something on the other side of the door, watching, waiting. Forcing herself to move, she slid out of bed, her bare feet hitting the icy floor. She winced at the chill but forced herself forward. She reached for the door, hesitated, then pressed her ear to the wood. Nothing. Summoning what little courage she had, Anna turned the handle and pulled the door open. The hallway stretched out before her, bathed in the faint glow of moonlight seeping through a window at the far end. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting slightly as though they were alive. She stepped into the hallway, her breath visible in the freezing air. The bathroom door stood ajar. A faint, flickering light shone from beneath it. Anna's heart skipped. "I didn't leave that light on," she whispered to herself. The sobbing started again. It came from the bathroom, louder now. Anna took a cautious step forward, each creak of the floorboards echoing like gunfire. The sobbing grew quieter as she neared, like whoever was inside knew she was approaching. Her trembling hand touched the door. "Hello," she whispered. The sobbing stopped. Silence engulfed her again. Anna pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, but the mirror above the sink was shattered. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, distorting her reflection into broken pieces. And then, from the largest shard, something stared back at her. It was Emily. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes hollow pits that burned into Anna's soul. Her neck hung at an impossible angle, the skin bruised dark and deep, as though hands still gripped it. Emily's lips curled into a smile that didn't belong to the living. Anna stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The reflection didn't move. Emily stared at her, unblinking. Then, from behind her, a whisper. "You let me suffer." Anna spun around, her scream lodged in her throat. The room was empty, but the voice lingered, echoing in her ears, cold and accusing. Anna turned back to the mirror. Emily was gone. The air grew colder. Anna's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled into the hallway. She fled back to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it, pressing her back against the wood, her chest heaving. The creaking started again. Creak, creak, creak. It stopped just outside her door. Anna didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then her gaze flickered toward the window. Emily's face stared back at her from the other side of the glass, pale, broken, and smiling. Anna screamed, the sound piercing the night as the shadows closed in. Hours later, when the sun finally rose, Anna remained curled up in the corner of her room. Her hands covered her ears, rocking gently as she whispered to herself, "It's not real. It's not real." But deep down she knew it was. The house remained silent. The shadows, however, seemed to linger, waiting for nightfall to begin again. Part 4. Growing terror. In the days that followed, the house became a prison of escalating terror. What began as unsettling noises and cold drafts soon spiraled into chaos, each event stripping away Anna's denial and leaving behind a raw, pulsing fear. It started small. On the first morning after the night in the bathroom, Anna entered the kitchen to find the floor covered in shattered glass. Every single plate, bowl, and cup had fallen from the cabinets, as if invisible hands had swept them onto the tiles. Her son, David, stood barefoot by the doorway, staring at the mess with wide, unblinking eyes. "David," Anna called softly, trying not to sound panicked. "What happened here?" David didn't answer. He just lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the center of the kitchen. Anna followed his gaze. For a moment she saw nothing, just shards of glass glinting like knives in the pale light. Then she saw it. The air above the floor seemed to ripple, like heat waves on asphalt. Anna's breath hitched as she felt the temperature drop around her. Her eyes burned as she tried to focus, and then, in the shifting air, came a sound. A faint whisper. "You let me suffer." Anna gasped, her body stiffening as a chill raced down her spine. David whimpered softly beside her, pressing his face into her side. She placed a protective hand on his head, forcing herself to look away from the shimmering spot in the room. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, though her voice trembled. It's just an accident. Go to the living room. Mommy will clean this up." David didn't move. "David," I said, "go. She's here," David whispered, his voice so faint Anna almost didn't hear it. "She's standing right there." Anna froze. Her heart stopped, and she turned her head slowly to follow David's gaze. He was staring at the same spot, the center of the kitchen floor. But now, where the air had only rippled before, there was a shape, a figure. Her. It was barely there, a shadow more solid than the rest, with no features, no color, but unmistakably human. It stood motionless, and though its face was empty, Anna felt its gaze on her. A pulse of freezing air filled the room, and David whimpered again. Anna grabbed him, pulling him from the room. "Don't look back," she shouted as she fled, her feet crunching over the broken glass. She slammed the kitchen door behind her and pressed her back against it, holding David tightly. The boy sobbed softly into her shoulder, his body shaking. From the other side of the door, the whispers returned, low and insistent, as though a chorus of voices murmured just beyond the wood. "You let me suffer." By that night, Anna's fragile resolve had begun to crack. She sat on the couch with David nestled beside her, his small fingers clutching her arm. The living room lights were on, casting a false sense of safety across the room. Anna stared at the television, though she wasn't watching. The news anchor's voice droned on, drowned out by her own thundering heartbeat. Then she heard it again. Soft whispers slithered through the hallways, brushing against her ears like icy fingers. Anna turned off the television. The whispers grew louder. They didn't form words, but the tone was unmistakable, accusing, condemning. "Mommy," David whispered, looking up at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Is it her again?" Anna swallowed. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" the lady, David replied. "She's sad, and she keeps looking at me." Anna's heart skipped a beat. "What lady, David? Where do you see her?" David pointed toward the hallway leading to his bedroom. Anna's throat tightened. She turned her gaze to the darkened hall. It felt alive, as though the shadows themselves were watching her. "Stay here," she said, her voice unsteady as she stood up. "Don't go, Mommy," David whimpered, grabbing her hand. "She doesn't want you to come." Anna knelt down and kissed the top of his head. "It's okay, baby. I'll be right back." She didn't believe her own words, but she had to look. She had to see for herself. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel, each step dragging her closer to the darkness at its end. The faint creak of the wooden floor echoed unnaturally, like something moving with her. Anna stopped outside David's room, her hand trembling as it hovered over the doorknob. She pushed it open. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the nightlight. Everything looked normal: the stuffed animals on the shelves, the tiny bed with its Spider-Man blanket. And then she saw it. Standing at the foot of the bed was a figure. It was Emily. Her head hung to one side, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. Her long, dark hair fell in limp strands across her pale face. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that burned into Anna's. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Anna stumbled backward, her foot catching on a toy. She fell hard, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp gasp. When she looked up, Emily was closer. "Emily," Anna whispered. "Why? Why are you here?" The figure raised a trembling hand and pointed at Anna. "You let me suffer." The whisper filled the room, though Emily's mouth remained unmoving. Anna scrambled to her feet and fled. She grabbed David from the couch and ran to the front door, but when she reached for the lock, it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing from all directions. "You let me suffer. You let me suffer. You let me suffer," David screamed, burying his face in her shoulder. Anna twisted the lock desperately, her fingers slick with sweat. At last, the door gave way. She stumbled outside, gasping for air as she slammed the door shut behind her. The house fell silent. Anna turned and ran into the night, clutching her son tightly as the shadows of the house loomed behind her. The next day, Anna sat in her sister Mary's living room, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. David sat quietly beside her, his head resting on her lap. "It's her," Mary, Anna said finally, her voice shaking. "Emily's back. She's in the house. She's haunting us." Mary's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, David lifted his head. "Mommy," he said softly, pointing toward the window. "She's here." Anna and Mary turned in unison. Outside the window, standing in the pale light of the afternoon sun, was Emily, her head twisted, her eyes hollow, and her mouth curled into that same accusing smile. The whispers returned. "You let me suffer." And this time, they didn't stop. Part 5. Mary's confession. Anna's hands trembled as she sat at Mary's kitchen table, the teacup untouched before her. The sun outside had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in the pale, weak glow of a single light bulb. Shadows gathered in the corners, thick and alive, as though they were watching, waiting. Across from her, Mary sat silently, her eyes red and swollen, staring down at her lap. The clock on the wall ticked incessantly, each second stretching unbearably as Anna's patience wore thin. The silence between them had lingered far too long. "I need you to tell me what's going on," Anna said, her voice shaking. She couldn't hide the anger beneath her fear any longer. "What did you mean when you said Emily's back? Why is she haunting me? My house, my son?" Mary flinched as though struck. She didn't look up. Mariana slammed her hand on the table, the sound shattering the silence. "I deserve the truth. You owe me that much." Mary's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Finally, her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shuddering breath. When she looked up at Anna, her face was pale, her expression haunted. "It's my fault," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all my fault." Anna stared at her, shocked. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Mary swallowed hard, her hands twisting together in her lap, as though trying to wring the truth from her own bones. "Emily. She came to me that night. The night her voice broke, and she choked on the word. The night she died." Anna felt the air leave her lungs. "What did she say?" Mary shook her head slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "She was crying. She looked so broken, Anna. She told me she couldn't take it anymore, the beatings, the loneliness, the way everyone pretended not to see what was happening. She begged me to help her." "You knew," Anna whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "You knew about what he was doing to her?" Mary nodded, her face crumpling in shame. "We all knew. The neighbors, the family. But we just looked away. We told ourselves it wasn't our place to get involved, that she'd figure it out on her own. And I didn't help her. I should have, but I didn't." Anna's stomach twisted. A sick, heavy feeling settled in her chest as the pieces began to click into place. "You said she came to you that night. What happened?" Mary covered her face with her hands, her voice muffled by her sobs. "She asked me to stay with her. She said she was afraid. I could see it in her eyes, Anna. She was begging for me to save her. But I told her I couldn't. I said I had to get home. I left her there, alone." The room seemed to darken as Mary's confession poured out. Anna's pulse pounded in her ears, her fingers digging into the edge of the table. Mary looked up then, her face streaked with tears. The next morning they found her, hanging from the beam in her bedroom. She left a note. Anna felt her skin go cold. "What did it say?" Mary's lips trembled as she whispered. "It said, 'None of you will rest.'" A chill ran through Anna, as though icy hands had brushed her spine. She pushed her chair back, her legs unsteady as she stood. "You knew she was suffering, and you left her there." Her voice cracked with anger and grief. "You could have saved her." Mary sobbed harder. "I know, Anna. I know. And now she's back. She's angry. She's blaming us. I've heard her too. In my house. In my dreams. I hear her whispering, accusing me. I see her shadow in the corners of the room, and when I turn, she's there staring at me with those eyes. Her hollow eyes." Anna staggered back, her mind spinning. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with an awful clarity. Emily's ghost wasn't wandering aimlessly. She had a purpose. A target. "She blames us," Anna said numbly. "The whole family. Everyone who ignored her. Everyone who looked the other way." Mary nodded, wiping her face with shaking hands. "I don't know what to do, Anna. She's not going to stop. Not until she's—" "What?" Anna snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "Not until she's what?" Mary looked at her sister, her eyes filled with something dark, a terror so raw it made Anna's stomach churn. "Not until we suffer too." That night, Anna couldn't sleep. The weight of Mary's confession pressed against her chest like a stone, suffocating her. The house was unnervingly quiet, but Anna knew better than to trust it. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision. shapes that seemed to twitch and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. David lay curled up in her bed, clutching his stuffed bear. His breathing was steady, a small comfort in the dark. Anna stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying Mary's words, "None of you will rest." Suddenly, a faint creak echoed through the hallway. Anna bolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. The sound was familiar, the same deliberate, measured creak she'd heard before. She glanced at David, who remained asleep, and carefully slipped out of bed. Her bare feet touched the cold floor as she crept toward the bedroom door. The hallway stretched before her like a yawning mouth, the darkness at its end deeper than it had any right to be. Creak, creak. The sound came again, closer this time. Anna held her breath and stepped into the hall. Her eyes darted from one shadowy corner to the next, searching for movement. Then she saw her. At the end of the hall, illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight through a window, stood Emily. Her head hung to one side, the bruised skin of her neck visible, even from a distance. Her hair fell in limp strands around her face, her hollow eyes locked onto Anna's. Emily's mouth moved, but the words were whispered on the air, carried to Anna like a breeze from the grave. "You let me suffer." Anna stumbled backward, tears springing to her eyes. "Emily, I'm sorry. I didn't know." The ghost stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on broken strings. With each step, the temperature dropped until Anna could see her breath fogging in front of her. "Please," Anna sobbed, falling to her knees. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Emily stopped just feet away, her hollow gaze boring into Anna's very soul. Then, slowly, she raised a single trembling hand and pointed. Anna turned to follow the gesture and froze. David stood in the doorway to the bedroom, his eyes wide with terror. Behind him, Part 6. The escalation of fear. The days passed like a slow-moving nightmare. Anna no longer felt safe in her own home. The very air seemed different, heavier, colder, as though the house itself had begun to turn against her. What once had been a haven now felt like a trap, its walls closing an inch by inch. She tried to tell herself that everything was in her head, a result of stress and exhaustion, but she knew better. The haunting had worsened, growing bolder with every passing hour, and the nights had become unbearable. It started the same way every night, small, seemingly harmless noises. The faint creaking of wood, like an old house settling into itself. But as the hours crept toward midnight, the sounds changed. They grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. Anna lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching the blanket to her chin. Beside her, David slept fitfully, his small body curled into a tight ball. The boy no longer slept in his room, he was too afraid. Anna wished she could reassure him, tell him the monster wasn't real. But she'd seen it too. She'd heard it. Thump. Thump. The sound started softly, like someone walking on tiptoes. It came from the hallway, growing louder with each passing minute. Anna gripped the blanket tighter, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Don't move. Don't breathe." The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. Anna froze, listening. The door didn't creak open, but she could feel something on the other side watching, waiting. The air turned freezing cold. Her breath fogged the space in front of her face. She glanced at David. He shivered even in his sleep. Then the whispering began. It was faint at first, drifting in through the cracks around the door, like a poisonous breeze. A chorus of voices, overlapping, indistinct, but filled with venom. Anna squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out. "You let me suffer. You let me suffer." The words wormed their way into her mind, relentless and accusing. Anna pressed her hands over her ears, silently begging for it to stop. Then the door rattled. A loud, violent thud shook the wood, jolting her upright in bed. David woke with a start, his eyes wide with terror as he clung to Anna. "Mommy," he cried. "Shh," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. "It's okay. It's okay," but it wasn't okay. The door rattled again, harder this time, as though something wanted in. Anna stared at the handle, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The whispering grew louder, the voices blending into an eerie, unnatural harmony. "You let me suffer. You let me suffer." Anna grabbed David and pulled him close, retreating as far as she could to the head of the bed. The whispering stopped abruptly. Silence filled the room, so heavy it felt suffocating. Then from the corner of the room came a sound. Creak, creak. Anna's head whipped toward the noise. The rocking chair, the one that had belonged to her grandmother, sat in the corner. It hadn't moved in years, but now it rocked slowly, back and forth, as though someone invisible were sitting in it. Anna couldn't look away. Her body refused to move. The chair creaked louder, its rhythm deliberate and unnerving. And then she saw her. Emily. She appeared in the chair as though she'd always been there. Her body slumped unnaturally, her neck hanging at a sickening angle. Her hollow eyes locked onto Anna, black and empty, pulling the breath from her lungs. Her lips moved soundlessly, but Anna didn't need to hear the words. She knew what Emily was saying. "You let me suffer." Anna screamed. By morning, the house was silent again. Anna sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she cradled a cup of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, her face pale and gaunt. David sat beside her, staring blankly at his cereal, the spoon untouched. He hadn't spoken a word since the night before. Anna glanced at the clock on the wall. The day stretched out before her like an eternity, each second dragging slower than the last. She couldn't bear to stay in the house, but where could she go? Mary had her own troubles. And besides, Anna knew the truth. Emily was here. The thought made her skin crawl. Her sister's presence clung to the house like mold, festering, spreading, poisoning everything. Anna knew Emily wouldn't stop, not until her anger was satisfied. A loud crash jolted her from her thoughts. The sound came from the living room. "David, stay here," she said quickly, pushing herself to her feet. She hurried toward the living room, her heart pounding. The moment she stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. The family photos, every single one of them, lay shattered on the floor. The frames were broken, the glass splintered. But that wasn't what made Anna freeze. The pictures had changed. In every photo, Emily's figure appeared. She stood in the background, staring at the camera with her hollow, lifeless eyes. In some of the photos, she was closer, her presence unnaturally large, her face twisted into that same faint, accusing smile. Anna backed away, her hands shaking. No. She turned to leave, but a faint sob stopped her in her tracks. It came from the hallway. Anna turned slowly, her blood running cold. The sound grew louder, rising and falling like a wave. It was coming from David's room. Her feet moved on their own, pulling her toward the source of the sound. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking. David's room was empty, but the air was freezing, and the sobbing echoed all around her. Anna stepped inside, her breath fogging in front of her. "Emily," she whispered, her voice breaking. The sobbing stopped. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, the closet door burst open. Emily stood inside, her body contorted and broken, her black eyes fixed on Anna, her mouth stretched wide in a soundless scream. Anna staggered backward, her own scream ripping through the air. By nightfall, Anna and David were barricaded in her bedroom. She dragged furniture against the door, but it wouldn't help. She could hear Emily in the house, footsteps pacing, doors slamming, whispers swirling through the halls like a storm. David clung to her, his small body shaking. "Mommy, make her go away," he whimpered. Tears streamed down Anna's face. "I'm trying, baby. I'm trying," but deep down she knew the truth. Emily wouldn't leave. Not until they suffered like she had, and the worst was yet to come. Part 7. The seventh night. The seventh night arrived like an unwelcome guest, dragging with it an oppressive weight that settled in every corner of Anna's house. The day had passed in a blur of exhaustion, dread clinging to her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Anna moved through her hours in a daze, barely speaking to David, barely eating. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been: a dripping faucet, a creaking floorboard, the faint whistle of wind against the window. It was as though the house was alive, whispering secrets in a language Anna couldn't understand. As darkness fell, the silence turned predatory. Outside, the moon disappeared behind thick clouds. The world beyond the windows was black, as though the night itself had swallowed it whole. The house groaned softly in the distance, a sound Anna had once found comforting but now dreaded. She lay in her bed, stiff and still, her pulse a frantic drumbeat beneath her skin. David was curled up beside her, his breathing soft but uneven. The boy hadn't slept properly in days, plagued by nightmares he refused to describe. Anna hadn't either. The clock on the nightstand blinked 3 a.m. The witching hour. Anna stared at the ceiling, the weight of her eyelids tempting her toward sleep. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe the night might pass peacefully. Maybe the seventh night would come and go, leaving them untouched. But then she felt it, a sudden suffocating pressure on her chest. Her eyes flew open, wide and panicked, as though someone had poured ice water into her veins. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to move, but her body refused to obey. It was as if invisible hands pressed her into the mattress, pinning her down. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst. "David," she croaked, though the word barely escaped her lips. Her son didn't stir. From the darkness above, something loomed. It began as a shadow, an absence of light that slowly took shape. Anna's chest seized as Emily's face emerged, floating inches above her. Her ghostly form hung suspended in the air, her blackened, hollow eyes locked onto Anna's. Her neck was twisted at a grotesque angle, bruised and mangled, as though the marks of death had never left her. Emily's mouth moved, but no sound came. The words echoed in Anna's head, whispered and sharp as broken glass. "You let me die." Anna's vision swam as panic clawed at her mind. Tears welled in her eyes, streaming down her face as she gasped for air. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice little more than a ragged wheeze. "Emily, please." "I didn't know." "I'm sorry." Emily's face contorted, a grotesque imitation of a smile pulling at her cracked lips. The room felt colder than before, the temperature dropping so fast that frost began to creep along the edges of the window pane. Anna's breath fogged in front of her face. "Sorry won't save you." Emily's voice grew louder, the words reverberating in Anna's skull. The crushing weight on her chest intensified. Anna squeezed her eyes shut, desperate to escape, but the whispers burrowed deeper. "You let me suffer. You let me die." The lamp on the nightstand flickered violently before shattering with a sharp pop. The room plunged into pitch black. Anna's scream rose in her throat but died before it could leave her lips. "Mommy," the sound of David's voice jolted Anna back into awareness. The crushing weight vanished, leaving her gasping for air as she shot upright in bed. Her hands flew to her chest, as if checking for invisible bruises. Beside her, David sat up, his wide eyes filled with tears. "It's okay," Anna whispered, though her voice trembled violently. "It's okay, baby. It's over," but the words felt hollow. From the far corner of the room came a sound, soft at first, then growing louder. The rhythmic groan of wood, slow and steady. Creak, creak, creak. Anna turned her head toward the sound, dread pooling like ice in her stomach. She couldn't see the rocking chair in the darkness, but she knew it was there. And it was moving. David clung to her arm, his small body shaking. "Mommy." "She's here, don't look," Anna whispered, her voice raw. "Keep your eyes closed, baby," but her own gaze was drawn to the corner, as if unseen hands forced her to look. Slowly her eyes adjusted to the dark, and there, rocking back and forth in the chair, was Emily. Her body was twisted and wrong, her neck hanging limp, her arms dangling at her sides. Her black eyes shone faintly in the darkness, locked onto Anna. With every creak of the chair, her head lulled unnaturally, the broken angle grotesque. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the room like a storm. "You let me die. You let me suffer. You let me die." The chair rocked faster, the creaking deafening. The shadows along the walls convulsed and writhed, as though they were alive. David began to sob, his cries barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. "Stop," Anna screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Emily, stop. Please." The chair suddenly stopped. The room fell deathly silent. And then Emily moved. Her body twisted as she stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with broken strings. Her bare feet dragged across the floor, the sound grating against Anna's ears. Anna's breath caught in her throat as Emily approached, her black eyes fixed on her. "David, run," Anna shouted. But David didn't move. He was paralyzed, his face pale, his gaze locked on Emily. Anna grabbed him, trying to pull him from the bed, but her limbs felt sluggish, heavy, as though the air itself was fighting against her. Emily stopped at the edge of the bed, looming over Anna and David. Her mouth opened wide, unnaturally wide, a silent scream spilling out as her shadow swallowed the room whole. Anna clutched David to her chest, her own scream tearing from her throat. The darkness consumed everything. When Anna opened her eyes, the morning light was streaming through the window. Her head throbbed, and her body ached as though she'd been crushed. For a moment she thought it might have been a dream. Then she looked at David. He sat beside her, his eyes wide and blank. His lips trembled as he whispered softly, his voice so quiet Anna had to lean closer to hear him. She said, "Sorry won't save us." Anna's blood turned to ice. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong, charged with a presence she could still feel lingering in the walls, in the air, in her bones. The seventh night had come and gone, but the nightmare was far from over. Part 8. The Unthinkable End. The days after the seventh night were a blur. The house's oppressive presence grew unbearable, the walls seeming to close in on Anna and David as the hours crept by. Shadows moved when they shouldn't have, doors creaked open on their own, and whispers slithered through the hallways like serpents. Anna barely ate or slept. She spent most of her time sitting in the living room, her eyes fixed on nothing, her mind frayed and raw. Every noise, a floorboard creaking, a distant tap-tap-tap against the window, made her heart lurch. The haunting had seeped into her very bones, its grip unrelenting. Even the daylight provided no comfort anymore. The house seemed darker somehow, as though it had swallowed the light itself. David was quieter than ever. He sat close to Anna at all times, his small hands clutching her arm or her clothing, as though afraid she might disappear. He hadn't spoken of Emily since that night, but Anna knew he could feel her too. Sometimes she caught him staring at a corner of the room, his face pale, his lips trembling. "Mommy," he whispered one afternoon. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Anna looked down at him, her eyes tired and bloodshot. "Yes, sweetheart." David didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on something just over her shoulder, his expression blank and distant. "She's waiting for you." Anna felt her blood run cold. By the sixth day, Anna's resolve had shattered completely. She couldn't escape Emily's ghost no matter where she went in the house. She felt her there, watching, judging, waiting. The nights were the worst. Every evening, as the clock ticked toward midnight, the air in the house would turn frigid, and the whispers would start. They came from everywhere and nowhere, circling Anna like vultures. "You let me suffer. You let me die." Anna begged for it to stop. She screamed at the walls, at the darkness, at Emily's unseen presence. But her cries went unanswered. Emily was always there. Her presence clung to Anna like a second skin, inescapable and suffocating. That was when Anna stopped fighting. The guilt weighed too heavily now. The truth of what they'd done, of what they'd not done, was inescapable. Anna saw it in her dreams. She saw Emily standing there in her tiny, broken room, the noose already tied. She saw the bruises, the tears, the utter hopelessness in her sister's eyes. And then she saw herself walking past, ignoring it, looking away when Emily needed her the most. "I should have done something," Anna thought again and again. "I could have saved her." But now it was too late. And Emily would never let her forget. On the seventh day, Mary came by the house. She had been worried when Anna hadn't answered her calls, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found. The door was unlocked. The house was deathly quiet. Anna Mary called softly, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. "Anna, are you here?" There was no answer. The air felt cold, unnaturally so. A chill slid down Mary's spine as she crept deeper into the house. The floors creaked beneath her feet, but the sound felt wrong, like it didn't belong to her. She found David in the living room. The boy was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. He didn't move when Mary entered. He didn't even blink. "David," Mary whispered, kneeling in front of him. "Where's your mommy?" David didn't answer. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were dull, empty. "She's with Emily," he said flatly. Mary's heart stopped. "What? What do you mean, sweetheart?" David blinked once. "She's in the bathroom." Mary stood quickly, her pulse thundering in her ears. She hurried down the hallway, dread twisting in her stomach. She already knew, deep down, what she would find. She reached the bathroom door and hesitated. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. The house was silent. So silent she could hear her own breathing, ragged, quick. Slowly she turned the knob and pushed the door open. And there was Anna. She hung from the ceiling, a length of rope looped tightly around her bruised neck. Her bare feet dangled inches above the floor. Her face was frozen in a look of pure terror, her wide eyes staring blankly into nothingness. Mary staggered backward, a scream tearing from her throat. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears burned her eyes. "Oh my God," she sobbed. "Oh my God, Anna." She didn't notice the frost that had formed on the mirror. She didn't hear the faint sound of laughter echoing softly through the room. But when she finally looked up, she saw the words scrawled into the fogged glass. "She let me suffer." The village was abuzz with whispers in the days that followed. Word of Anna's death spread quickly. And though the official story called it a tragic suicide, everyone knew the truth was darker than that. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices about the curse, Emily's curse, and the price that had been paid for ignoring her cries. They spoke of David, too. The boy hadn't spoken a word since his mother's death. He simply sat in silence, his vacant stare fixed on something no one else could see. "He's been marked," the villagers murmured. "Emily's ghost isn't finished yet." At night, some claimed to see Anna's house bathed in pale light, a flickering shadow moving behind the windows. Others heard sobbing carried on the wind or the faint creak of a rocking chair in the distance. But no one dared to go near. And as for Emily, her name became a whispered warning, passed from one generation to the next. A story to frighten children, to keep them from turning a blind eye to those in need. But some knew better. Some knew that Emily was still out there, wandering through the darkness, her black eyes searching for the next soul who would let her suffer. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Part 9. The Lingering Presence. Even after Anna's tragic death, the village never returned to peace. What had once been a sleepy, forgotten corner of the world now lay under an invisible shadow, a curse whispered about in secret but never spoken aloud. Emily's presence had seeped into the bones of the village, a wound that refused to heal. It began with the nights. The quiet no longer felt comforting, it felt watchful. The villagers soon realized that the darkness held something unnatural, something that waited, listening, breathing. Those who passed by Anna's house after sunset swore they heard faint noises coming from within its rotting walls. Creak, creak, creak. The sound of a rope swinging back and forth, slow, deliberate, haunting. Some claimed it was the wind, a natural creaking of the old timbers, but others knew better. Those brave or foolish enough to stop and listen would hear more. A whisper, soft, slithering, like dead leaves scraping across stone. The voice was faint but clear, rising and falling like an incantation. "You let me suffer." The whispers carried on the breeze, curling through windows, slipping beneath locked doors. They were heard in dreams and in waking moments, scratching at the edges of sanity. The villagers tried to ignore them, to pretend the sounds were figments of imagination, but the whispers grew louder. Soon, children began waking in the night, screaming about a woman standing at the foot of their beds. "Her neck is broken," they cried. "Her eyes are black, and she's looking at me." Their parents comforted them, whispering hollow reassurances, but the fear lingered. The children refused to sleep alone. They refused to go near Anna's house, even in the safety of daylight. The house itself became a thing of legend. Anna's home sat on the edge of the village, its once bright facade now dulled and crumbling. The windows, streaked with grime, seemed to watch anyone who passed, like dead eyes peering into the world. Weeds overtook the garden, crawling up the walls like dark veins. The house exuded a coldness even on the hottest summer days. The air around it was unnaturally chilled. One evening, a group of teenagers dared each other to approach. "I'll go inside," one boy boasted, puffing out his chest. "It's just a stupid house," the others laughed nervously, but none dared to follow as he pushed open the creaking gate. His footsteps crunched over the dead grass as he approached the door. The air grew colder with every step, and the boy's confidence began to waver. He reached the front steps and paused. The house seemed to breathe a faint exhale of air that sent goosebumps racing across his arms. He turned back to his friends, grinning weakly. "See? Nothing to be scared of." A loud slam cut him off. The front door swung shut behind him with a force that rattled the windows. The boy's grin vanished. He spun around, his hands shaking as he grabbed the knob, but it wouldn't budge. His friends shouted for him, their voices muffled as though they were miles away. Then he heard it. The creaking. Creak. 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 The sound came from somewhere deep in the house. The boy froze, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the floor, like blackened fingers reaching for him. "Hello," he whispered, his voice cracking. The whisper came in response. "You let me suffer." The boy stumbled backward, his hand still clawing at the doorknob. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form barely visible in the gloom. Her head hung at an unnatural angle, and her black eyes glimmered faintly. Emily. Her broken body moved toward him in slow, jerky motions. With each step, the whispers grew louder, echoing in his ears, filling his mind. "You let me suffer. You let me suffer." The boy's screams tore through the air, but when his friends broke the door down minutes later, the house was empty. There was no sign of him. The only sound was the faint creaking of the rocking chair upstairs, moving on its own. Over the following months, the disappearances continued. People went missing near Anna's house: a curious passerby, a reckless teenager, a wandering stranger. None were ever found. The villagers stopped walking near the house altogether, taking longer routes to avoid it. Parents warned their children to stay far away. And yet, the whispers persisted. Some heard them in their own homes, late at night, when the world had gone still. Others swore they saw Emily's ghost wandering through the village, her black eyes glinting in windows, her twisted silhouette lurking at the edge of the forest. The story spread like wildfire. Emily's curse, they called it, a punishment for the village's neglect. A reminder of what happens when the cries of the desperate go unheard. Some villagers tried to leave, but it didn't matter. Emily's whispers followed them wherever they went, carried on the wind like a poison. "You let me suffer." Those who stayed behind grew paranoid. They avoided speaking Emily's name, as though the mere mention of her might summon her ghost. They nailed their windows shut and slept with lights on, but it made no difference. She was everywhere, lingering just out of sight, waiting for the next soul to punish. The house still stands today. Its windows remain dark, its doors locked tight, but those who approach can still hear the sounds. Creak, creak, creak. The rhythmic groan of the rope swinging back and forth. On quiet nights, if the wind is still, you might hear the whispers too soft, accusing, impossible to escape, you let me suffer. Some say Emily's spirit will never rest, that her grief, her anger, and her pain are too great to fade. Others believe the house is a gateway now, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead have dissolved completely. But one thing is certain. Emily remains. She is the shadow at the edge of the room, the whisper in your ear when you are alone, the cold breath on the back of your neck, a chilling reminder of what happens when cries for help go unanswered. And when the village sleeps, she walks among them, unseen and unheard, her black eyes searching, always searching for someone new to share her suffering. The story of Emily is not forgotten, because some ghosts never die.